Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In here, I and my friend want to explain about should Taiwan have to leave China. In here, there is Exa Reva Amaliyah and I'm Sada dengan Shaddai for fulfill our assignment about studies of China. Taiwan, as known as Formosa, is the one of the part of the Republic of China and the capital of Taipei. Taiwan is island located off the coast southeast of Asia between the Southeast and Southeast China Sea. At the first, Taiwan have been under China power, particularly when colonized Netherlands and Japan. Taiwan were divided during a civil war in 1914, but Beijing insists the island will be reclaimed at some point by force if necessary. The conflict with the Nationalist Party was led by Chiang Kai-shek. So he established the territory of Taiwan because he lost of civil war with the Communist Party led by Mao Zedong. The policy can be traced of the end Chinese Civil War. The defeated nationalists, also known as the Kuomintang, retreat to Taiwan and made it their seat of government, while the victorious communists began ruling the mainland as the People's Republic of China. Both sides, they represented all China, since the China ruling Communist Party has threatened to use force if Taiwan ever formally declares independence, but it has also pursued a softer diplomatic track with the island. In 1990, Taiwan wanted to democrate without interference from China against, with proving in 1996, Taiwan had carried out the presidential election with electors Li Tengshui. After his election, the relationship between China and Taiwan was always more worse and full of tension, especially in the relationship between Taiwan and the United States getting closer because the United States is major weapon supplier. Also, China tried to disrupt president election with missile tests, and the United States dispatched aircraft carrier to region to dissuade them. In 2008, the relationship between Taiwan and China was better in under leading of Ma Ying-jeou and Hu Jintao, have marked by an increased economy with trade cooperation. But in 2015, Taiwan peoples again what Ma did were overvalued to pro-China. The one China policy is distinct, whereby China instance Taiwan is an alienable part of one China to be reunified one day. The diplomatic acknowledgement of China position that there's only one Chinese government. Under the policy, the United States recognized has former ties with China rather than the islands of Taiwan, which means China see a breakaway province to be reunified with the mainland one day. Taiwan is the island has an own constitution, democratically election leaders, and about 300,000 active troops in its armed force, and only a few countries recognize Taiwan. Most recognize the Chinese government in Beijing instead. The United States has no official ties with Taiwan, but does have a law that requires to pursue the island with the means to defend itself. So in the end, we know that China is really pressing its one China policy and will do anything possible to make the island part of the People's Republic of China. But it is important to know the difference between them, whether it is on the ideology, government system, or economic. We decide to make this team because there are many people that still consider Taiwan as the province of China, which in the reality it isn't. They have sovereignty and they oppose the one China policy because it's contradictory in their sovereignty and also national interest. True, Taiwan government claims it is an independent country officially called the Republic of China. Any country that want diplomatic relation with mainland China must break official ties with Taipei. This has a result in Taiwan diplomatic isolation from the international community, like Taiwan is hardly joined again to United Nations. We want to explain in action China and Taiwan in economic and military on Xi Jinping era.
Okay, so in China economic power, China is the world's largest producer of rice and is among the principal sources of wheat, corn or maize, tobacco, soybeans, peanuts or granules, and cotton. The country is one of the world's largest producer of a number of industrial and mineral products, including cotton cloth, tungsten, and antimony, and is an important producer of cotton yarn, coal, crude oil, and a number of other products. China is well endowed with mineral resources, and more than 3 dozen minerals have proven economically important reserves. The country has rich overall energy potential, but most of it remains to be developed. In addition, the geographical distribution of energy places most of these resources far from their major industrial users. Basically, the Northeast is rich in coal and petroleum. The central part of North China has abundant coal, and the Southwest has great hydroelectric potential. However, the industrialized regions around Guangzhou or Canton and the lower Yangtze region around Shanghai have too little energy, while there is little industry located near major energy resource areas other than in the southern part of the Northeast. Mining accounts for a small portion of China's overall gross domestic product or GDP and employs only a teeny fraction of the country's workforce. It likewise represents a small to significant part of the annual value of industrial output. Since China began to open up and reform in its economy in 1978, GDP growth has averaged almost 10% a year, and more than 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. There have also been significant improvements in access to health, education, and other services over the same period. China is now an upper middle income country. It will be important going forward that poverty alleviation efforts increasingly shift to address the vulnerabilities faced by the large number of people still considered poor by the standards of middle income countries, including those living in urban areas. China's high growth based on resource-intensive manufacturing, export, and low-paid labor has largely reached its limits and has led to economic, social, and environmental imbalances. Readjusting these imbalances requires shifts in the structure of the economy from low-end manufacturing to higher-end manufacturing and services, and from investment to consumption. Following real GDP growth of 2.3% in 2020, China's economy is projected to grow by 8.5% in 2021, largely driven by base effects. The growth momentum is slowing, reflecting the large impact of policy and macroprudential tightening, floods, and the recent Delta outbreak. Although lingering tighter restriction and cautious sentiment due to the recent Delta outbreaks will weigh on the consumption recovery. Its impact is expected to be largely offset by robust foreign demand and moderate policy support in the latter half of the year. Near-term risks have shifted to the downside, with the key risk being recurring outbreaks led by more transmissible COVID-19 variants, which could lead to significant economic disruption. Over the medium term, China's economy is facing structural headwinds given adverse demographics, tepid productivity growth, and the legacies of excessive borrowing and environmental pollution. These challenges require attention with short-term macroeconomic policies and structural reforms aimed at reinvigorating the shift to be more balanced, high-quality growth.
About Taiwan, throughout its history, Taiwan has experienced periods of economic boom and bust. Several centuries ago, the island was a major trading center in East Asia and prospered. Taiwan grew economically under Dutch rule in the mid 1000s and the late 90,000s under China's rule. It did well economically as a colony of Japan from 1965 to 1945, but experienced a decline the years immediately after World War II. Taiwan initially industrialization was first the growth of textile factories and companies that produce light manufactures such as small appliances, woodware, and athletic equipment. Companies subsequently have moved to manufacture semiconductors and electric equipment, including radios, television sets, and computers. By the mid 1918s, Taiwan had become of the world's largest producer of computers and computer peripherals. It also succeeds in establishing steel and shipbuilding industry, but those were of less significant than the enterprise manufacture information and communication technology or ICT products. One reason given for that circumstance is that Taiwan's economy is based primarily on small and medium-sized companies rather than on large conglomerates, as has been the case in Japan and South Korea. Since the beginning of the 21st century, however, Taiwan farmers have been hit hard by foreign competition, in part because individual farms on the islands are small, but also because after Taiwan joined the World Trade Organization in 2002, it became easier to import cheaper foreign agricultural products. Rising livestock has very little battle. Pigs, chickens, and ducks have been preferred over cattle, but all options have met with difficulties in the face of foreign import. Farmers who raise fruit and vegetables have fared somewhat better, and those growing tea and some special crops have done fairly. Because Taiwan have such a high dependence on foreign fuel import, it has diversified its source of those commodities and has considerable storage capacity. Almost of its petroleum is imported from the Middle East. It by coals safely from Australia, Indonesia, and South Africa. Natural gas is purchased mainly from Qatar, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Taiwan may export the electronics, basic metals, and the metal products, plastic and rubbers, chemicals, and the machinery. Its principal exporting trading partners include China, including Hong Kong. Countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN, the United States, Japan, and South Korea. Taiwan major import commodities include electrical machinery and appliances, mineral fuels, and, and mineral products and chemicals. Its chief import sources are China, Japan, ASEAN countries, and the United States, the countries of the European Union and South Asia. Next.
Okay, so the history of China's relation with the WTO started with the formation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. Shortly after the Second World War, the Republic of China, or ROC, became a contracting member when it signed the Final Act of Geneva on 30 October 1947, and subsequently one of the 23 founding members of GATT on 21 May 1948. The ROC formally withdrew from GATT in early 1950 amidst confusion resulting from the move of its seat of government to Taiwan upon the establishment in Beijing of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, in October 1949. For a time, neither the ROC nor the PRC was represented in GATT. The PRC initially had little interest in trade with non-communist world and thus had little need for GATT membership. In any event, it is unlikely that GATT would have welcomed the PRC membership at that time either because of China's socialist closed system of trading and its anti-capitalist and anti-American stance. In the 10 years after its move to Taiwan, the GATT membership was not a high priority for the ROC. However, in the 1960s, as Taiwan began to establish itself as an important trading power, interest in GATT participation returned. In 1965, the ROC began attending GATT meetings as an observer. A major change came about in October 1971 when the PRC was formally admitted to the United Nations, while the ROC was forced to leave the world body. Subsequently, China acquired membership of a large number of specialized agencies affiliated with the UN system, forcing Taiwan to leave them. This included the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and others. In the case of GATT, as a result of China's insistence on a de-recognition of the ROC upon its admission to the UN, Taiwan lost its observer status in November 1971. During the 1970s, China was not ready for GATT membership. It was only after the adoption of the reform and opening up policy in the late 1970s that China's external trade began to experience a rapid expansion, and subsequently there was a felt need to enter GATT.
About Taiwan and WTO. The saga of Taiwan participation in the World Trade System began in the late 1940s. The The Republic of China was the one of the original signatories of the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade or GATT, but the national government withdrew in March 1950, in part because it could no longer fulfill trade commitments of mainland China. In 1965, Taiwan applied for the received GATT observer status. Then in 1971, the GATT took away Taiwan observer status after the People's Republic of China was given China's seat in the United Nations and Taiwan's representatives were expelled. This was one instance of the practice of GATT to follow United Nations decision on high political matters. Taiwan began its odyssey to join the GATT in 1990. A working party on Chinese Taipei was set up in 1992 and Taiwan became an observer. At the time, the chairman of the GATT Council stated that all parties had agreed that there was only one China, and the chairman had and then proposed the Taiwan entry should be finals until after China entry. That sequencing was agreed to because of that initial decision. Taiwan accession was delayed from 11 years until China accession could be negotiated. The details of China accession proved very difficult to work out because China was asked to accept special rules in its accession different from what was required by normal WTO rules. Taiwan was granted accession to the WTO on 11 November 2001, a day after similar accord with respect to China. The effective date of Taiwan entry into the WTO was 1 January 2002, which was 2001 days after China entry. The reason why the WTO was able to admit Taiwan, in spite of the contest international legal status, is that membership in the WTO is not contingent upon statehood. Almost all WTO members countries are states, yet WTO membership is available not only to states but also any separate custom territory possessing full autonomy in the conduct of its external commercial relations and of the other matters. Taiwan entered Taiwan entered into the WTO through accession as a custom territory. Taiwan is apparently the only custom territory ever admitted to the multilateral trading system that is from 1947 forward, without direct sponsorship by a state exercising diplomatic relation for it. No judicial review in the WTO is available as to the determination of whether an entity qualifies as a separate custom territory possessing full autonomy in the conduct of its external commercial relations.
Taiwan's membership in the WTO has led to mild tension with China in Geneva. According to a press account, China's mission to the WTO sends a complaining note to any governments that calls Taiwan in WTO proceedings. A few years ago, China suggested that Taiwan should change the name of its mission to the WTO to match those of WTO members Hong Kong, China, and Macau, China. Hong Kong's mission calls itself the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office, and Macau has a similar designation. Then WTO Director General Supachai Panijpakdi reportedly asked Taiwan to adhere to China's request. Taiwan refused such a name change. In July 2005, China finally accepted the name that Taiwan had given its mission to the WTO, which is the Permanent Mission of the Separate Custom Territory of Taiwan, Penghu, Kinmen, and Matsu. But China continues to protest the use of diplomatic titles for most of the staff at Taiwan's permanent mission. Surprisingly, the WTO Secretariat has sided with China and in 2005 removed those titles from the internal WTO members directory. Taiwan has protested this discriminatory action by the WTO Secretariat, but to no avail. Note that the WTO agreement does not provide any judicial review of administrative action taken by WTO Secretariat. Although Taiwan agreed in its accession negotiation to seek membership in the WTO agreement on government procurement, that negotiation has stalled over opposition from China. China is concerned that accession could give the implication that Taiwan's government is not part of China. This implication could arise from the listing of the specific governmental entities that will abide by the agreement. Ironically, China itself is not a party to the agreement, but apparently can still influence who may join. Now that Taiwan is a member of the WTO, its status there seems secure. The WTO agreement does not contain any provision for expelling or disqualifying member governments. Nevertheless, the trading system has shown a continuing ability to improvise, so anything is possible. Should Taiwan ever come under the political control of China, the question of multiple votes might be raised. At this time, Macau, China, and Hong Kong, China get their own separate votes in the WTO. Although some commentators have suggested that Taiwan and China's membership in the WTO puts them on same par as each other, that does not necessarily have implication for Taiwan and China's bilateral relationship. After all, Hong Kong, China, and Macau, China are also members of the WTO, and no one assumes that this status will change their legal relationship with China. But given the history of animosity between Taiwan and China, the fact that the two countries are now members of the World Trade Club could influence their mutual paths of legal socialization. Some analysts have suggested that because the agreement establishing the WTO is a multilateral treaty, that it is conceptually decomposable into a combination of all possible bilateral treaties among members. With 149 WTO members, that will be 11,026 bilaterals. In my view, this is a misleading way to look at the WTO. The fact that China and Taiwan are both members of the WTO does not mean that they have a bilateral trade agreement. Rather, they have both done to the same thing. Each has joined the WTO. Of course, in joining the WTO, both Taiwan and China choose not to involve non-application under Article 13 of the WTO agreement. The absence of non-application might be construed as application, but the application is not the same thing as an explicit bilateral agreement. What application means is that Taiwan and China agreed that WTO rules would apply inter se just as they normally apply between all other pairs of WTO member countries. So Taiwan and China have legal obligation toward each other as members of the WTO, but not through a treaty between them. Thus, the fact that China and Taiwan are members of the WTO does not mean that China acknowledges Taiwan's legal personality on the international plane. For Taiwan to join the WTO did not require China to sign any WTO document. Taiwan became a member of the WTO after the WTO approved the protocol of accession with Taiwan, and then Taiwan signed or otherwise approved the protocol. Because the WTO agreement imposes obligation on China with respect to how it treats Taiwan and on Taiwan with respect to how it treats China, the entry of both parties into the WTO has the potential for changing their bilateral economic and political relationship. By permitting Taiwan to join the WTO through accession, the WTO and its members acknowledge that Taiwan is a separate custom territory, possessing full autonomy in the conduct of its external commercial relations and of the matters provided for in the WTO agreement. Thus, it could be that WTO member governments are now stopped from denying that Taiwan possesses such autonomy. When Taiwan's accession to the WTO was approved, Taiwan's President Chen Shui-bian said with regard to Taiwan and China that the WTO offers a forum for both sides to interact in a multilateral context and try to learn to live with each other under one roof as competitors, business rivals, or even partners. So far, little in thus harmony has seemingly occurred, but the potential is always there for both governments to use the WTO forum for communication. Taiwan has a number of trade restrictions against China that may violate WTO rules and could be the basis of a dispute against Taiwan lodged by China. The fifth one is Taiwan's discrimination against trade in China's goods, trade in China's services involving investment-related commercial presence and the movement of natural persons. These types of trade entail a requirement for pre-approval. Direct commerce between Taiwan and the mainland was long prohibited by Taiwan, but was slightly liberalized in July 2006. So far, however, China has not brought a case against Taiwan, apparently because doing so would acknowledge Taiwan's separateness from China. China has also shown an unwillingness to fulfill its own requirements under WTO rules to notify Taiwan before initiating a safeguard action against its trade or an anti-dumping investigation of goods from Taiwan. Even so, Taiwan has not invoked WTO dispute settlement against China. Recently, China accepted a visit by a Taiwanese government official to conduct an anti-dumping investigation, and agreed to talk with Taiwan about a proposed import safeguard by Taiwan on towels. Perhaps the most significant potential effect of Taiwan's WTO membership is that it could invoke WTO dispute settlement should China attempt to impose economic sanctions against Taiwan. The WTO dispute system is the only international body that Taiwan would have access to, as Taiwan cannot lodge cases before the International Court of Justice or bring a complaint to the UN Security Council.
And about China and Taiwan military aspect. China economy is the 4 times the size of Taiwan's and apparently growing at a faster rate. That economic disparity between China and Taiwan could eventually lead to a military disparity as well. Nonetheless, even in informal United States security guarantee for Taiwan against nuclear army, China is ill-devised. Taiwan is not strategically essential to American national security. Moreover, China has significant incentive to avoid attacking Taiwan. Perhaps the most crucial is not it. Perhaps the most crucial is that hostile behavior toward Taiwan could jeopardize China increasing economic link with the United States and another case country. Taiwan has several military advantages that it could exploit. First, Taiwan could use a porcupine strategy to deter China. Taiwan does not need to able to win a conflict with more powerful China. It needs only to inflict unacceptable damage on China first. Second, Taiwan would have the advantage of defending an island against an ambitious an attack that is extremely hard to execute successfully. Prospects for a successful defense are enhanced because China would be unlikely to have strategic surprise or naval supremacy or sufficient landing force, fleet air defense, or naval gunfire support. Third, because of current Taiwanese naval superiority, including submarines warfare capabilities and defenses in China's fleet air defense and command and control, even a partial China's naval blockade would be difficult to carry out. Fourth, Chinese missile strikes on Taiwan could be countered with enhanced passive defense and retaliatory strikes on the Chinese homeland by the superior Taiwanese Air Force. Rather than provide an informal security guarantee to Taiwan, the United States should show that national more arms to defend itself. President Paz has authorized the sale of more weapons, but Taiwan needs to spend more on its own defense and actually buy the needed weapons. The Taiwanese military can most likely dissuade China from attacking. Determining the intention of country is difficult, but China has some important intensive to avoid attacking or imitating Taiwan by military means. Such hostile action could have counterproductive political and economic effect. In 1996, China tried to imitate voters in the Taiwanese presidential election by firing missiles into the Taiwan Strait during a training exercise. True, China sought to intimidate the Taiwanese electorate, its action had the opposite effect. The Taiwanese elected by the wider margin than expected, a president who took a more independent stance vis-a-vis China. Although China avoided similarly provocative military action prior to the Taiwanese election of 2000, have learned it least a little. Belligerent Chinese rhetoric prior to the polling was still counterproductive. Shen Shuibian, a candidate favoring Taiwan independence from China, was elected president of Taiwan. Now China worried about Taiwan moved further down the path toward independence threatens Taiwan merely to define the status quo, but hostile behavior toward Taiwan could disrupt China's increasing economic links with the rest of the world, especially its growing commercial links with Taiwan. Because China's highest priority is economic growth, the disruption of the such economic relationship is a disincentive for China to take aggressive action vis-a-vis Taiwan. Any attack short of invasion, splashing more missiles, or instituting a naval blockade would like harm the Taiwanese economics and disrupt China's trade and financial contacts with Taiwan and other developed nations without getting China what is most want. Controls of Taiwan. An ambitious invasion unlikely event that its success would provide such control but would cause even greater disruption in China commercial links to developed nations, probably resulting in economic sanctions against China and reductions of vital foreign investment there. Even the Pentagon notes China apparently is sensitive to the potential political and economic costs that could incur from war with Taiwan. To that end, Beijing has avoided activities that may threaten its economic growth and access to foreign market, investment, and technology. In addition, an examination of the most likely conflict scenarios indicates that China's ability to success in intimidating or overrunning Taiwan has been overstated. Intimidation with missile launch or actual attacks in 1996, China tried to intimidate Taiwan with missile tests in the Taiwan Strait during Chinese military exercise at the time of the Taiwanese presidential elections. As noted earlier, however, those actions had the opposite effect that intended. Actually, missile attacks on Taiwan for the purpose of terrorizing the Chinese population will probably cause an even greater speculation against China in Taiwan and the international community and could trigger retaliatory raids and and on the mainland by the superior Taiwanese Air Force. An attack by 300 Chinese short-range missiles on Taiwanese cities would do less damage than one sortie of the Taiwanese Air Force against China. The Chinese are vulnerable to attacks from the air because they have integrated air defense system. China does not now have enough missiles of sufficient accurate missiles to have significant effect when used against Taiwanese military target. Sweeney and Movin estimate that China will not have that capability until 2010 or 2015. Even the hawkish congressionally mandated China Security Review Commission admit a barrage. Even the hundreds of Chinese ballistic and cruise missiles fired against Taiwan would actually do limited or at least not permanently devastating damage unless China restored to chemical, biological, and or nuclear warheads, or the missile strike is coordinated with other concurrent operations such as air and maritime engagement. The problems with the air and maritime operation have been discussed above. It is also unlikely that China would use weapons of mass destruction against China because massive casualties would show economics and political connection with the rest of the world. As Chinese missiles become more numerous and accurate missile attacks, even with conventional warhead, would become a more military consequential. They would probably be used to attempt to knock out or damage Taiwanese airfields, air defense, and command center prior to ambitious invasion of the island, the risks of which for China were discussed earlier. Its missiles were used by China to strike such military targets through the Taiwanese Air Force could retaliate with punitive strikes and on the mainland. In addition, as noted below, passive defense measures could reduce significantly the effectiveness of China missiles attacks on military targets. Conservatives and some liberals have called for a tri-security relationship between the United States and Taiwan. They note that Taiwan is not a democracy that is dwarfed by an authoritarian China, but in populations and economic power, not yet. Their agreements are made through Cold War lens rather than from a dispassionate assessment of United States security interests. In a post-Cold War world, the political and economic reforms initiated by Taiwan are laudable, but that does not mean the United States should put its own homeland at risk by dueling with a nuclear army great powers over a small, non-strategic island. Besides, China will probably remain deterred from attacking Taiwan regardless of whether or not the United States guarantees Taiwan's security. Economic development is China's top priority, and attacking Taiwan would adversely affect the international economic linkage that course, in addition to that, China-Taiwan army force do not need to able to defeat China in any conflict. They must merely be able to execute a porcupine strategy that is inflict unacceptable damage on China force. In absence of a United States security guarantee, Taiwan should be able to carry out that strategy by increasing its purchase of weapons from the United States. Taiwan does not show enough on its defense and will not do so as long as the United States over the protection of an informal security umbrella. Thus, the United States should win Taiwan from such protection and future increasing arms sales to that nation. The independence and long-term security of both nations would be approved.
So the conclusion of our topic today, should Taiwan exit from China? We think that China must maintain Taiwan because if Taiwan is separated from Chinese rule, it will also have a big impact on Hong Kong and Macau. Seeing the potential for economic and security cooperation, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau are more open than China. This can be the reason China must continue to maintain relations so that China's power can become stronger with the three countries that can support China. That's it for our podcast today. Me and Rema, I apologize if there is any mistake in our podcast. See you and goodbye. I will close this podcast. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.